You don't forget, if you'd like to join us in this community that we are a part of, go to remoteaf.co and click on the community button. Join our Discord community. Everybody talking about all things remote, or of course you can join us regularly on that Talking Remote. Today I've got a fantastic guest. This is going to be the second in our ongoing series of how you govern dynamically adaptive organisations. And you should see James here. How are you today, James?
Good, Tony. How are you, mate?
Good, fantastic. Dave unfortunately couldn't make it with us, and so we'll make sure that we royally do refer to Dave as the royal we as we talk through it today. We would have gone through a lot of these last time with you, talking about the pillars. We're not going to talk about the whole of the governing system, right? Transparency, leadership, systems, and information is how we see that as the pillars of governance that you use when you're governing dynamically adaptive organisations. Today, we're going to really focus in on one of those, which is systems of work in our ongoing series. So let's start with that and think about what the systems of work. When we talk about systems of work, James, what are we talking about when we're talking about governing systems of work?
Yeah, cool. So good question, and it's a big answer. Let's start with you thinking about the basic systems on which you do work and how you actually deliver value, right? So you need to think about the value streams, what is it that you do that creates, that goes from some idea that someone wants to pay for something through to you've actually delivered that value and pleased the customer and made some money. Or alternatively, in public service, pleased the customer and made some public value. So that's all kinds of things from the IT systems, the value streams, all of the systems on which you do work, the processes by which you do work, but it's also broader than that, right? Without getting too deep into trying to explain systems thinking, which we can leave for other people on another day, it's all of the systems and how they interact together in your organization, which is, as you've explained previously, if we've got a dynamically adaptive organization, that's already a really complex area to get into, but it's all of those kinds of systems. If you have a set of really fit for purpose value streams designed to deliver work really well, but then elsewhere in your organization, say you've got systems that don't go along that way, like say you've got bonus systems, your HR bonuses, or the way that you measure performance, all of those things come into play, because if they don't go along with what you're trying to do, then those systems can tend to counteract each other, and you wind up with a great big mess. So it's not just the specific systems that you're doing work on, but it's the whole systems of the organization.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. I'll pick up on that a little. Well, we'll go wide on it, I think, a little bit here. So I'll pick you up on that, because you're talking about it's actually all of the systems of work, right? And you're also talking about, having value streams, which is the thing at the moment, and product teams, which is another thing at the moment, right? But essentially what we see is people are changing the transitional state of their organization. And what I mean by that is that's the flow of the work, where the work gets done. Mm-hmm. And so they transition the state of how that works. Now, they might not transition that in total. Like you said, they could be between two worlds, or if they do, and they class that as a transformation, but that's not transformational to me, because what happens then is the minute you transition the flow of work, and yes, we want to design for flow, but you actually have to think about how you govern the system of work, from steering to enabling, enhancing, to how you actually make and do the work. And that's where I think organizations tend to fall down, is they start here, but they don't worry about that. And then the pressure comes on, because they've got all of these, old archetypal, traditional models of governing the system of work. What's your thoughts on that, James? Do you see that around?
Yeah, I do. I've seen really good work where, say, people have defined out all of their customer journeys and tried to say, right, this is what we're going to focus on, and we're going to try to measure ourselves by how well we impact the customer journey, and they can even provide ways to measure that, which is fantastic. But if you don't then have the leadership right first, common understanding of that throughout the organization, so from the CEO, director, all the way down, Everyone needs to be speaking that common language and understanding how they're going to try to measure that improvement. So first of all, you've got to have that common language, and then secondly, all of the systems have got to be in behind it. Very often, organisations will say, "Okay, we're trying to become a little bit more agile, or become a little bit more responsive to customers, or whatever it might be," and they'll change some small parts of the organisation, and that's reasonable. You don't necessarily want to do some great big bang change to everything all at once, and I'd probably recommend that you don't most of the time. But there's always friction points for the parts that have changed and the parts that haven't changed. And for me, the most important thing is that you realise where you expect friction to be, and you look out for it, and when it does happen, you do something about it. I've seen things where, and again, coming back to your HR systems, where people are incentivized by, say, quality. And so they're incentivized to make sure that nothing gets created that breaks. And if they're making sure that the customer experience is always good, they're not likely to create a new customer experience. And they're likely to fight against a new customer experience, because in that situation, it might not be great. You can't be confident. So when you have these incentives that work against it, and that's not necessarily in any particular part of the organization, but if an executive is in charge of a particular business line, and the way they are measured is by the quality reported from the customer, that's brilliant. But they're unlikely to try to create new experiences for that customer.
Yeah. I want to go a little bit deeper on a couple of things and break it down a little bit as well. I'll pick up on a couple of things that you just said there. And there's certain attributes that get ignored in this transitional change rather than transformational change, right? Or even when I've seen organizations do transformation, they tend to ignore it. And in my estimation, that's part and parcel, because when we talk governing the system of work or governance in total, we're not just talking PMOs and projects, right? I just want to keep repeating that.
Yeah.
There's so much more to that, but that is a part of it. But it's also thinking about how our leadership. So that's why, in the pillars of governance, we talk about leadership. It's intrinsically built into that. So how you actually lead the system, but there's also funding as well. So, you've got a 3-speed economy. If you're not careful, very quickly, you end up with your actual flow of work, or your transitional space of where you do the work, going one way. Your governance system in terms of the portfolio or the enabling enhancing mechanism going one way, and your funding going the other way. You got massive big funding cycles, et cetera, and then that ends up creating such a tension in the organisation that really just shackles delivery. Yeah. What's your thoughts on that one?
So that is a really common experience, but what I've found most of the time is funding is not necessarily something that needs to change, but people need to have a really clear understanding of how best to use it.
Yeah.
There are organizations where there are, if you have the right product manager who understands how to talk to the right people in finance in the right way, then you get a good project. And if you don't have that skill, then your project is doomed to fail. And it's got absolutely nothing to do with the skill of the project manager of managing projects. It's about, how well can they interact with the rest of the organization. But often funding can be created in whatever way is going to be helpful, but people don't know that. So it's really important, if you're trying to create, smaller rounds of feedback, that you don't necessarily need to create a whole new way of funding, but you need to have the CFO make it really clear that there's already options available, which is usually the case, right? That's usually the case, that we can say, hey, we're going to fund this on a 2-weekly basis or a quarterly basis or whatever, and we're going to have these checks, and we're going to go in different directions depending. And those kinds of things are really common, whether you're a waterfall or a brand new startup or whatever it might be. But usually, because people don't quite understand that funding and the financial governance, they feel really constrained by what they know. So it's important for me that CFO on down engage really closely with the rest of the organization to explain how we can change, what the different options are. And usually that means putting finance people right deeply into those. If you're trying to organize by customer journey, then into the different customer journey streams, into the different product teams and so on, and have them work so closely that they're actually part of those teams. Often if you wind up with the actual finance function as a shared service, and they come back together kind of like a chapter or a community of practice or something. So they've got guidance on how they operate, but they're actually part of that group dedicated to trying to improve I keep coming back to customer journey, but we keep coming back to customer journey, but whatever it might be, if they're part of that and they're deeply invested in it, then very often those problems go away. I've seen it many times.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, I was working with an organization recently, very refreshing, because when we were doing the design, so we talk about design for flow, and a lot of organizations talk about design for flow at the moment, right? Whether that be customer journeys or whatever it be, but it's designing your organization for flow. But one of the things they do is they design that in separation. And the organization I was working with, that was, the CFO and the CFO nominations, they were hand in hip in, so to speak, right? And helping to design it and talking about, well, how are you going to fund that, or what are the things we need to know from you to allow us to understand the funding, and et cetera, et cetera. Right? Yeah. So, the one thing I would say when if people are moving into this and thinking about how you govern the system of work and designing for flow, don't be afraid of working with your financial people. It's the same as working with audit. It's the same as working with legislative people. Bring them into the mix, because the closer to the mix, the better the flow that you'll create through your organization. I talked about designing for flow, and that's a really important piece that we talk about in systems of work these days, is how we design for flow through the organization. Talk to me a little bit about your thoughts on that, James.
So when you're trying to work it, first of all, you got to work out what the flow is, right? And generally, I refer to it, as I mentioned earlier, the flow is, there's some kind of thing that you can do that starts out as there's an idea that you can do a bunch of stuff. And once you've finished doing that, you've created some value for your customer, or value for society, value for however you define value. So when you're trying to design in order to make that flow as efficient as possible, then what you're trying to do is make sure that you go from, hey, we've got an idea, it's a really small idea, we do a small piece of work and create a small piece of value as efficiently and as effectively as possible. What does that mean? Generally, that means things that are pretty well understood in the, I guess, in the agile world and beyond these days, which is you probably want a cross-functional team. So you're not handing something from one team that can do one thing to another team that can do another thing to another team that can do another thing. You don't have these functional silos where these ideas have to go into so many queues. The cross-functional team is really about saying we've got one queue and we can get a piece of work as close from beginning to end as possible. Which, if you go into the tech world, you're talking about your agile delivery teams, and then you're talking about your DevOps type teams. So as you're not just building something to done in a pre-production environment, but you're going from idea through to done into production and being supported. So that's where all of that came from, is trying to design that for flow. So part of it is your teaming design, but part of it is also the rest of your governance design. If you have a, I guess, simple example from back in the day of an agile software delivery team, hey, we're producing all these stories and they're getting done really well. We're reasonably effective. Stop. We've got a quarterly release cycle, and we've got to do a huge amount of work every quarter to go about meeting all of the stage gates in order to allow that release to go through, right? That's a point where part of your system is designed for flow, and part of your system is specifically designed to slow you down, and designed for quality, not for flow, right? And we know now that there are a whole lot of ways to change that, to do that a whole lot better, put a whole lot of automation in, have these releases that go through, multiple times a minute, whatever it might be, where you're actually increasing quality at the same time that you're increasing flow.
Yeah.
The reason I bring that as an example is you've done some teaming work to design for flow. You've got these agile teams, but the rest of your organization, be it the IT governance and the release governance, is not designed for flow.
Yeah.
Sometimes that might be perfectly okay if that's what you want, in which case stop trying to say that you're designing for flow. You're not, and that might be fine, but just be upfront about it. And if you are trying to design for flow, then you have to know, if you're in a situation like that you're in a transition state and you need to keep on improving.
Yeah, I agree.
Start to answer the question?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I'll again dig a little deeper on a couple of things you said there. So one of those, you said, literally it's got to click in with your other systems of governance, right, that we talk about. And if I think about it in terms of the way we talk about the governing systems in the pillars, if you're designing for flow, what a lot of organizations miss in my estimation around the system of governance is thinking about how you design for flow, but not only just the flow of the work, but it's the flow of information that comes from that work that allows you to make decisions and enables you. So if you're thinking about your pillars of governance, as we talk about them, you need to be thinking about how you design that for transparency of information that allows that information to flow backwards and forwards through your collaborative connective tissues, both horizontally and vertically of the organization. And yes, I got it in ding, but it allows you to get it backwards and forwards, right? So you don't end up with, as our good friend Esther would talk about, that bifurcation of knowledge. People up here know everything. People down here know nothing, right? And then you've got a mix of that.
Yeah.
But it's also thinking about the other pillar of governance is how you govern that with your leading of the system as well. The leadership will have to change when you introduce flow. Thoughts?
Yeah, so first of all, if you're trying to govern for flow, then the only way you can do that is if you start to measure it. And so you need the information about, what is our flow like? What is the speed at which we go from someone wants something to the customer gets something? How quick is that? Are we actually, how are we flowing, and what are all the steps in the system? So, designing that out and actually measuring it is super important. And then making sure that everybody knows about which measurements are important. And I'm a big proponent of looking at your cycle time. So how long does it take for a piece of work to get done? And you can measure your cycle time, within a team, but also your cycle time from a customer presses a button and says, I need help, to they've got the help, to they've been billed, we've got the money, all the way through that process. You can follow that entire cycle. And really what you're trying to do is make that process as fast, as efficient as possible, and the outcome to be as effective as possible. So first of all, yes, you need it to be transparent, and you need everybody to be looking at the same information and know what's important, right? It's you don't want to have a situation where you say, well, look, customer asked me for something and I did my bit and I passed on the request as quickly as possible, so I'm happy. I'm in the call center, I've spoken to the customer, I know what they want, I've dealt with them, I've been really nice and kind, and I've passed this information on to another team. My cycle time is great. And also, generally, if you're looking at cycle time when you're face to face with customers, you need to look at a few other things as well. Otherwise, you get some pretty nasty incentives, and people are hanging up on customers after 2 minutes to make sure their cycle time stays high. But we've done the work that we need to do. We've pleased our customer. We've passed that on. I'm happy. Has the customer actually got anything? Not yet, but it's with someone else, so I'm happy. You need to make sure that you're incentivizing looking after the customer. And most organizations do that really well. And the fact is, most people who are dealing with customers are really well aware of that, right? Most people who deal with customers want to help the customer. If they know that they've looked after the customer and sent it on, and now the customer's not going to get anything, those people aren't happy.
Yeah.
They're pretty demoralized. So it's not generally the fault of the people doing the work. It's generally the fault of the design of the system, right? So you've got to make sure that everybody understands what's important, and what's important is usually what that person on the phone to the customer knows, which is they need help and they haven't got it yet. then you've got to measure that and make sure that everybody across is bought into it. And then you've got to say, well, yeah, you mentioned leadership. Okay, how do we, once we see that some of the cycle time is great, and then there's this other bit that's a handoff, and nobody does that work for 3 weeks, and then someone presses a button and the customer's got what they need after all. Well, how do we actually change that and lead that system to improve? So, I've seen that happen where leaders is just, well, I'm accountable for this bit, so I'm happy. Yes, my people aren't happy because they're not actually, they know their customers aren't getting what they want, but I'm happy and I can prove to my boss that my team's doing well. So I'm all right. I don't have an incentive to look after them because we're not, the back of house team, I'm not accountable for them. And the back of house team has a different incentive, which might be to save money. And that's a perfectly reasonable incentive. But if you actually want to be measuring the flow by which you're getting information, getting value to the customer, and you've got to be measuring that whole thing from the customer calls and asks for something so they get it. And you need to be upfront and share that information across the entire organization. So the CEO knows the same things that the people on the phone know, which is customers getting the first part really quickly and they're getting the second part really slowly. And then everyone's got that transparency. You need leaders to understand, well, how do we actually change this system? What can we make some small improvements? Can we bring some people from that back of house team into the front of house and have small cross-functional teams? That's something that I've seen work really well sometimes. But there's nothing perfect. So if you try that experiment, how are you going to know if it's actually working or not? How are you going to sell that change to the organization and all the people in it?
And I think that comes to that layer of portfolio that people or organizations tend to just continually to try and run with their typical Prince 2 PMI. Yes, I know everybody's going to start throwing arrows at Tony, but the reality of that is that what you're looking for is adaptive portfolio, adaptive governance, and the ability to actually make those decisions and you change and adapt to what is actually happening to you. We talk about the extrinsic VUCA out there where that's putting pressure on your organization, but it creates intrinsic VUCA within your organization from that it's put on the outside onto the internal, right? And that's really important because you need to be able to adapt to that. And to do that, you need information flow. You need to design for flow, but you also need to have that. I think that also flows into something else that we talk about. It's the control mechanisms as well. A lot of the control mechanisms are still built. And when I talk about control, I hate that word, but that's the reality of what happens at this moment in time. Is it's still control is very focused and not distributed. Leadership holds on to that at certain levels where we talk about, we want to push down the autonomy for the ability for people to make the decisioning, close in person, place and time, close to where the work gets done by the people that do the work in time, and provide them with the right guide rails to be able to make that decisioning. Yeah. You seeing that happening around, James? I see that quite regularly. It's one of the things that I work with a lot is having to adjust how we change that leadership mechanisms. We're still within the organizational construct because there are certain things you have to hold on to, right? But
what I've seen more recently is leaders saying, I wish my people would make more decisions without coming to me.
Yeah.
And so what's happening is leaders are trying to enable their teams. They're trying to empower them and say, you can do this. But what they haven't done is kind of make that explicit. And so something I've done with a lot of teams, and even executive groups is say, let's work through a decision design, a decision matrix, a decision plan, whatever it might be, to say, what sorts of decisions do we often have to make and who's going to make them?
Yeah.
And you'll often find leaders will say, well, I don't think I should be making that decision. I think my team should be. They haven't made that explicit. And so the team's sitting there going, well, we'll get in trouble if we make that decision. We need to ask the boss. And the boss is like, why do they keep coming to me? So having some really simple conversations often it's between a leader of a team and a team, or between a sub-executive leader and the leaders under them. But it's also true at executive level. Having some really simple things, like I often use the management 3.0 decision poker, right? But whether you do that or whether you just do a decision map and say, right, here's types of decisions that we have, here's the person who can make the decision. The things we've got in remote AF are great. It's like, what do we make by ourselves? What do we bring to the team? And what do we need to refer upwards? Simple three column map, which works really well. But the thing that people don't usually do is actually have that conversation really clearly with each other. And sometimes it's like, yeah, why did you make that decision? I should have made it. But more often, I've found everyone's waiting for the other people to make the decision. And leaders are overwhelmed with having to make all these decisions. And what they sometimes do is they say, well, clearly my team's not ready for that amount of responsibility, so I have to make these decisions. And just stopping, having that conversation is often really empowering for everybody.
Yeah, no, I agree. And there's a question that's come through, which is really good. They're saying, are you not talking more about leadership here than you are in systems of work? And it's a good pickup because they're inextricably bound.
Well, that decision framework is a system of work.
Correct.
So I'm talking specifically about a really important system that you need to make explicit rather than implicit. Once you've got one, well, stopping the team and saying, hey, we don't have this and we need to do it, that's leadership. But actually having one, that's the system of work that we're talking about. So yeah, they're very, very closely linked.
All of the pillars are inextricably bound, which is why this series is existing for us to demonstrate that, I think, in Pink. So it's a good pickup. I agree with you, James, and I think there's a point there is when you are designing your systems of work, don't just focus on the actual work of the teams, but how you're going to do all of those things that are around it, right? So we talk about this, the principles of governance, decide what you're going to decide when you're going to decide how you're going to decide, and decide who's going to decide.
Yep.
Wow, I said that all in one go, right?
Yeah, well done, mate.
But that you have to ask those questions at your design. So what I see, it's something that people, organizations fall into. They go, we're going to have cross-functional sticky teams and we're going to have product teams and we're going to put all these together. But then they don't take the principles of governance and they don't create the adaptive governance that's required to enable those systems to operate in a way that allows the work to flow. Yep. So, when we talk design for flow, when we talk about designing the system of governance in the systems of work, this is what we're talking about. So I think there's another piece that goes with that, because these things are all interlinked, but I think the big thing there is also there's a big piece around if you're going to do this and you're going to design your systems of work and governance in a way that's going to allow the organisation to flow. There's also that piece which is inextricably bound to it, which is the clarity of purpose and intent, being able to link your strategic intent to your delivery. What's your thoughts on that, James?
Well, you got to have that first. You've got to know what it is you're trying to achieve as an organisation. And then you can start to measure it, and then you can start to design, well, how do we achieve that intent as well as possible? And when I say as well as possible, because it might be, look, our intent is to make sure that, that this particular system never goes down, right? It might be our intent is that we look after systems that every taxpayer needs to use all the time, and we're not about changing it rapidly. We are about making sure that it's always available to every taxpayer, right? In which case, you're not talking about flow as being able to change the system as quickly as possible, but you're talking about, first of all, our intent is maintaining something. So then secondly, how do we go about doing that as effectively as possible? And then you can measure that. You might be, we're in a startup mode and our intent is to deliver this brand new idea as quickly as possible, get it out to as many people as possible, and change it as we get feedback as quickly as possible, in which case you're in a whole different intent and you've got to design your entire systems differently. So first of all, you've got to know what it is that you're trying to achieve as an organization, and then you can go about measuring it and designing your systems around it. One of those, if you're trying to do something that, is really well maintained and always available and changes slowly, and I'm just using these as kind of examples of different ways to approach things. In that case, you still need a decision framework as an example, but the decisions are probably going to be more centralized more often. If you're trying to respond to things as quickly as possible and change as quickly as possible, then the decisions are going to be further down, closer in person, place, and time to the work more often. Right? So it's really about understanding that intent first, and then designing your systems, and be that a decision-making framework, be that how do we stop and check on the work that we're doing? Do we have, you might have a PMO which establishes very careful stage gates where everyone stops and checks if you are going to be changing a system that needs to be available to every person in the country all of the time. And that might be very reasonable. But if you've got that same kind of stage gate where you're trying to continuously change and respond to feedback, probably not going to work the same.
Yeah. Look, the other one I see is enterprise organizations in general are great at creating strategy and generally do have that strategic intent, right?
Yep.
They often have a great strategy and have that strategic intent. The issue that I see with that is the ability then to plug it into the ability to deliver and to also have that transparency of flow. So the whole organization knows the direction of travel. How do you break that strategic intent down and link it into your system of work? So I know we're talking about systems of work.
Yep.
Just preempting that in case someone picks me up on it. But your systems of work have to include that flow of information and knowledge that's coming down that gives you that direction of travel. Now, one of those ways that you can do that, and it's obviously, again, one of those things that gets used a lot, is objectives and key results. But unfortunately, what I see with that is that they become more of a KPI type, bang people on the head mechanism than the ability to flow the information into your system of work. So you actually have to think about how you design your system of work with that in mind.
Yep. So they are a part of the system, right? Whether you've got OKRs or whatever your incentives are, however you decompose strategy to work, then that's a key part of the system, your systems of work. So then you've got to see if it's working. I've seen plenty of organizations where they've moved to OKRs and they've been helpful. I've seen plenty of organizations where they've moved to OKRs and they've never really quite worked. I've seen where, okay, well, this is our OKR, so the whole organization only works on that, nothing else, to the expense of things that they really should have been doing. Or, well, we know we've got all these other things to do, the OKRs just for, if we've got some time. None of these are right or wrong, but again, measure what it is you're trying to achieve and then check and see are the incentive systems that we've got actually helping us?
Yeah.
Are we devolving strategy to work in the right way or in a way that works for us? Sometimes you might say, we've got some OKRs, they're not working, but they're not hurting. So we're not going to change it immediately because we've got other bigger fish to fry. Maybe they'll work in a little while. Sometimes you say, look, some teams will create their own OKRs and that's a good way for them to work. It's a good way for us to establish whether they're achieving what their goals are, but they're not really working as a devolving higher level strategy to work, and that's okay. I'm really kind of agnostic on OKRs themselves. What I think is important is if you're a senior leader in an organization and you know what your strategy is, how do you actually measure who's executing on that strategy and how well they're doing it? And that's OKRs can be a great way of doing that.
They can, yeah.
But they can also not form that function at all, and you're actually creating these OKRs, but also doing something totally else in order to measure your strategy. In which case, probably not worth doing two things. People will get lost if you're given strategic direction one way, and then also got OKRs or KPIs or whatever it is to do something else.
Yeah, I pick you up on that because it's a very poignant point. And I had the opportunity to talk with Stephen Bungay, The Art of Action. Yep. And I asked him a question around that, and he literally said to me, if you're thinking about your system of work and you're using objective key results, well, be very clear. Executives need to really think about that. Be very clear about what you're asking for, because you're going to get that and you're going to get more of that. And if you're not asking in a way that it's broken down and plugged into your actual ability to deliver, you're going to find you're getting things that you never thought you don't really want, right? So, I think that's a really clear pointer into that. We've talked about that in Essential, and people are going to say, well, we probably dialed in today to hear about your thoughts on teaming as well, right? So let's talk about that a little bit, because it's part of the puzzle, as we've said.
Yep.
And when we talk about dynamically adaptive organizations and we talk about governing those, dynamically adaptive organizations, we think about that in dynamic teaming and operating systems. We think about that in adaptive leadership, adaptive governance, which is the part of the whole. And then, thinking about deliberately developmental organizations. And that piece to me is about how thinking about your teaming as well. So there's an intrinsic link between the teaming and how you enable your organization's capabilities around that. So that's all part and parcel of the system of work as well. And I think that sort of flies through to the keeper sometimes. When you're designing these teams, you need to think about how they're dynamically going to change. Now, I know that the Agile community for a very long time, and I'm going to be a heretic here, I'm sure, have stuck on this thing about, have to have sticky teams.
Yep.
And the reality of life that I've come to know over my I'm in my third decade of agility. Teams will change, whether you like it or not. Yes, I know, third decade. That means I'm old, James. Teams will change whether you like it or not.
I didn't say anything.
But how do you deal with it, right? So the construct of the team, perhaps we can keep sticky, but you're going to have to dynamically re-team and adapt to that. And that's about your governing system of work as well, as being ready for that. And in the dynamically thinking about, deliberately developmental pieces, how do you enable your people ready for that, right?
Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking about a few things here. I used to work with many years ago. I worked with a woman who was fantastic, and she was lovely. She was older. She had a disability. She had a son with a disability, and this was a part of a large telco that had a whole bunch of contract workers, right? So they wanted to make sure that they had flexibility to move people around, move teams around on a daily basis. And what happened was a whole lot of these contractors would be there, super long term through an agency over a period of years. And some of them would be people like Gwenda, who would be there, for year on year and fantastic. And others would be people who just got a job for a couple of weeks, uni students or fly-by-nighters, and every now and then they'd get a phone call and say, look, we don't need you anymore. And Gwenda lived in fear of that call, and she didn't need to, right? She was never going to get that call, but she didn't know that, and there was no way of knowing that. And what that is creating a really, really flexible workforce, teams that actually exist long term, but don't have any sense of security, and it's a really sad and hard way to live. So, on the other hand, you can create teams where everybody is super secure, really long-lasting teams, and they may achieve high performance or they may achieve adequate performance, but they're going to tend to stagnate over time. Right? The ideal in the agile world, where we're talking about software development, is that long-lasting team, because you are going to fluke high performance sometimes if you pull a bunch of people together. Sometimes you're going to get great performance if you pull a bunch of the best people in your organization together and give them a really clear directive and just say, go. I got a friend who worked on a project, and basically it was vital for the entire, it was nationally viewed. There was a really specific deadline, and they just got all of the people that they knew could do the job, put them in a room and said, you've got 3 months and the entire country is going to know whether you succeed or fail.
Yeah.
I won't give more detail than that on this, but that was a really hugely high performing team, and it was the time of their lives, and they achieved it, and everybody in the whole country knew and thought it was great. So it's not about necessarily having a long lasting team, but a really common way of achieving high performance is to have a long lasting team. And that also gives you the ability to measure their performance, and it gives you the ability to kind of moderate that flow, right? So I don't like when you've got this whole workforce and none of them feel secure. I don't love when you've got the whole workforce and everyone's like, well, whenever you come in, you've got a desk, but you don't know where it is. That works really well for some people. But I think about Glenda, who I worked with way back in the day. All she wanted was to be able to come into work, do a really good job, look after the customer, and know where she was going to sit, put a photo of her family, and carry on and do a job. And I think that's perfectly reasonable request, So that level of security, I think, is really important. Not necessarily for everyone, but for a lot of people. So I might have gone off on a bit of a tangent when you're talking about team design, but I try to first of all think about the people and think what's important to people. And some people want and deserve that security. Some people are going to be excited to come in and do something different every day. Once you've got that understanding and you can have that communication between the people and say, look, how are we going to work together? Then sure, you don't want a long-lasting team that doesn't change at all. I think in my software development kind of agile team point of view, I would tend to think that, and I'd be interested if you disagree, you probably want a long-lasting team where people work well together, but you certainly want regular change to it, right? I think about a sports team. You always want a few new people and a few veterans, and you want that team to kind of be constantly regenerating. And at the same time, the team's not radically different one day to the next.
Yeah, I think don't mistake what I'm saying about that. Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you with that, and I believe you do need that. It's like any ecosystem. If it stagnates, if you don't have that fresh information or the fresh ideas coming into it, so you do need, and that's going to happen anyway, right?
Yeah.
Very, very rarely in organisations does that happen. But what I do talk about with that dynamic teaming is that the situation of the organisation now is going to change. There's such extrinsic VUCA out there that puts pressures on the organisational construct. They're going to have to adapt, to move and change.
Yep.
And in doing that, that means your teaming and your operating design is going to be regularly adapt. Well, if it isn't, then you won't be an organisation that either thrives or stays alive, right? And so in terms of that means that the missions of those teams or the constructs of those teams may change, or how they're focused may change. And I think in terms of the thing that you just said, that may not change what they actually do, or it may change what they do, but we have to be very deliberate about being developmental about that in terms of uplifting people's capability and saying, okay, we're going to move to that. What are the capabilities we need to future-proof? What are the capabilities we need to, how do we enable our people so they don't sit in that situation, if that makes sense?
Yeah. And that also comes back to funding, right? So, hey, we've designed this customer journey and we want to invest a whole lot of technology in improving it. So we've got all these tech teams based on improving a particular customer journey. That might last for a year or two, or a quarter, or a month. And then you say, well, okay, we don't want to invest so much in that piece of technology because we've got it where we want it. We now want to maintain it. We want to be investing more in another customer journey or another part of the same customer journey. So you need to be able to move teams around, and you need to be able to sometimes say, well, look, these teams just aren't relevant anymore. What are we going to do? We move them. Do we repurpose them? Do we actually dissolve the team and get people to go somewhere else? So there's a bunch of different ways of approaching that, but it comes first and foremost from how much do you want to invest in a particular area?
Yeah.
And then it comes back to, well, what are the principles by which we operate as an organization? And if one of the principles is we're a fast-moving and exciting organization where things change all the time, then you might just dissolve all those teams and say, right, everybody, you're creating a whole bunch of new teams, and it's kind of expected part of how the organization works.
That's right.
If that's not how you are, then you probably don't want to do that so much, and you probably want to take a team and move that team to be able to work in some other part of a customer journey, which also means you've got to think about, and if we're talking about software development, it also means that you've got to think about your architecture and technology. Because if you then say, well, actually, we want to move this team over there, oh, well, that's totally different technology. They don't have any of those skills. In which case, you've got some other problems on your hands. And you're more likely to have a more contingent workforce where you're hiring people through vendors because there's no point having a whole lot of people on board and dedicated to your organization when you don't know how long you're going to want to be able to invest in a particular technology. So then you need really good vendor relationships, and it's much harder, but very possible, and I've done it, to get those vendors working together and working with people in the organization and dedicated to a particular customer journey or a particular outcome.
Yeah. Look, I'd love to keep talking on that, but we're come to the end of our time nearly, and there's one question I've been saving there, which is a really good one. Bit of a hot topic, but it's nice to finish it off on. They've been part of the journey where an organisation or a consultancy has just given them a model rather than the model being designed with the organisation. It didn't work. What's your thoughts on that? Well, how about it, James?
I'm not surprised. Look, there are plenty of organisations. They're saying, what's the saying? No one's lost their job by hiring McKinsey. You get these organisations in sometimes to tell you what you want them to tell you, sometimes because you're just not sure and you want to delay. And they'll generally say, right, here's a model that'll work for you. If you implement this, then you'll be fine. Sometimes they recommend that, okay, now you've got to go to some other consultancy or hire us for a bit longer in order to be able to actually implement it well. But I'm not a big believer in any of that. I think, as the questioner alluded to, you want to do some co-design of your organisation. And you need, as with culture change, organisation change, op model change, you need to involve the people to co-design and own it, not just give them something and wander off into the sunset. I don't think I've ever seen that work particularly well.
I've said it so many times where the pattern's just been applied. With the complete belligerence of not thinking about the system of work, the system of governance, and the people. We've been talking a lot about governing the system of work, but people are intrinsically part of that. And the reality of it is, it's the people that know the work best, know how it gets done, and know how the organisation functions should be involved in that, because they understand the things that make the organisation work in its best way. Now, sometimes there's a bit of quid pro quo because there are things that want to be achieved and you might want to have a different direction. But that's okay. Having people involved in that particular design of it. So all I would say, I'm not going to get into consultancy or any kind of organisational bashing, but if you're talking with a consultancy or you're talking to somebody who's going to help you with your organisation, they should be the ones that are actually saying to you, we're going to come and design this. We're going to work with you to do this.
Yeah.
We're going to help you build your capability to do this, because that's how you get the best results.
Yep. It might be some teaching and then some co-design and then some teaching and some co-design. It might be, and you've got to come back as well to what's the intent? Why are you trying to redesign things? And that needs to come from the very top of the organisation, and it needs to be commonly understood throughout the organisation.
Yeah. And certainly, they play a part in being able to help you, guide you in the things and pitfalls and the best mechanisms to do so. But the intrinsic knowledge of the organisation is the important thing here that you need to actually build into it. Look, we could talk about that one forever. We're at the end of our time. Thanks again, James. For those listening and anybody who's going to be watching this in retrospect, because we do push this out, don't forget to come and join us at remoteaf.co. Click on the community button and join us. Join us in our Discord, because we're talking remote. We're not always just at talking remote here. The other thing that's really important for me to say to you is that this is just one in the series. So look for our next series next month. We'll hopefully have Dave back with us. We really didn't give him too much of a hard time today, but we should have.
Yeah, we missed that.
Yeah, we missed that. Yeah. Sorry, Dave. We missed you, believe it or not. And join us at Talking Remote, where we're talking about governing dynamically adaptive organisations. James, fantastic to have you today.
Good to see you, Tony. Thanks for your time. And thanks, everybody.
Yeah, absolute pleasure.